Leave the estate before sunrise, Duchess, and do not mistake the name you wear for a place you belong." The words struck the ballroom with the force of a door slammed shut. Lady Evelyn Ashcombe stood beneath the glow of dozens of candles, one gloved hand resting against the edge of the marble table, while every noble guest within Greyhaven Manor pretended not to listen. They listened anyway. They always listened when a woman's dignity was being taken from her. The musicians had stopped playing. The servants along the walls lowered their eyes, and the man who had spoken those cruel words stood only a few feet away, her husband, the Duke of Valancrest. For 6 months, the marriage between Evelyn Ashcombe and Duke Julian Valancrest had existed only as a name written on paper, a contract arranged between two families, a solution to debts inheritance concerns, and the preservation of two ancient estates. Nothing more. At least, that was what everyone believed. The guests watched as Julian held the folded document that had once brought them together. His expression was controlled, almost indifferent, but his voice carried enough coldness to make the entire room understand the message. The Duchess of Valancrest had never truly been his wife. She had simply been the woman who fulfilled an obligation. A few people smiled behind their fans. A few exchanged whispers. Lady Corisande Valawick, the Duke's widowed aunt, and the woman who had encouraged the arrangement, allowed herself the smallest satisfied smile. Evelyn saw it. She saw the triumph in the older woman's eyes. Not because a marriage had failed, because a woman had been made powerless. "I understand, Your Grace," Evelyn replied quietly. Her calmness seemed to surprise them. They expected tears. They expected pleading. They expected the young Duchess who had arrived at Greyhaven with a modest dowry and no powerful relatives to beg for the protection of the man whose title she carried. But Evelyn only removed the pearl bracelet that had been given to her on her wedding day and placed it beside the contract. "I believe this belongs with the agreement." The room became silent, not the uncomfortable silence of embarrassment, a different kind. The silence of people realizing they had misunderstood someone. Julian looked at the bracelet. For the first time that evening, his expression changed, only slightly. But Evelyn noticed. She had spent months learning the smallest movements of a man who rarely allowed anyone to see his thoughts. The tightening of his hand, the brief hesitation, the way his eyes followed hers when she stepped away. She had not married him for affection. She had not expected affection. Her father's death had left Ashcombe Cottage and its surrounding lands burdened with debts that Evelyn could not pay alone. Her stepmother had considered selling the property piece by piece until Julian's proposal arrived. A marriage contract, a title, financial protection, a respectable solution. Evelyn had accepted because there had been no other choice, but she had never accepted being treated as a possession. "Where will you go?" One of the guests whispered loudly enough for others to hear. It was not a question asked out of concern. It was a question asked to remind her that she had nowhere to belong. Evelyn turned toward the voice. "I have managed before, madam." The answer was simple, but it carried the weight of a woman who had already survived losing everything once. She left the ballroom without another word. Behind her, the conversation slowly returned. The laughter returned. The music began again, but something had changed. Because the people who had watched Evelyn Ashcombe be dismissed did not know that the quiet woman walking away from them had already made a decision. And before that night ended, the secret hidden inside the marriage contract would begin to threaten the entire Valancrest family. If you are listening from a quiet corner of the world, tell us where you are hearing this story today. Subscribe to the channel and turn on notifications so you never miss another tale of forgotten courage, hidden injustice, and the fight for dignity. And if these stories matter to you, support the channel so more voices from the past can finally be remembered. Now let us return to the beginning, to the winter, when Evelyn Ashcombe first entered Greyhaven Manor and believed a contract could protect her. Evelyn had learned early that a woman without wealth lived differently from a woman without a title. The world might praise kindness, loyalty, and patience, but society respected only what could be inherited, purchased, or defended by a powerful name. After her father's passing, Evelyn had discovered how quickly affection could disappear when money became uncertain. The rooms at Ashcombe Cottage grew colder. The servants who remained became fewer. The silver pieces that once decorated the dining table disappeared one by one. Her stepmother, Lady Honoria Ashcombe, insisted it was necessary. Sacrifices expected from women, Honoria had told her. But Evelyn noticed that the sacrifices were always hers. The comfortable rooms belonged to Honoria. The finest coats belonged to Honoria. The remaining funds were carefully protected for Honoria's future. Evelyn received only explanations. When Duke Julian Valancrest's marriage proposal arrived, it came inside a leather folder carried by his solicitor. There was no romantic letter, no declaration of devotion, only terms, a financial arrangement, a promise that Ashcombe Cottage would be protected, a promise that Evelyn would receive the position of Duchess, and a condition that both families agreed would benefit everyone. Everyone except, perhaps, the woman whose life was being rearranged. Yet Evelyn had signed, not because she dreamed of becoming a duchess, because she wanted to save the home her mother had loved. The first time she arrived at Greyhaven Manor, winter rain covered the stone walls, and the wind moved through the trees like a warning. The estate was magnificent, but it did not feel welcoming. The servants bowed because she had a title. The family members greeted her because they had to. And Julian Valancrest looked at her as though she were another document waiting to be filed away. Their wedding had been quiet. Their conversations had been polite. Their marriage had been carefully controlled. No arguments, no affection, no expectations. They lived in the same house as strangers. But Evelyn noticed things others did not. She noticed that Julian spent hours in his locked study reviewing estate records. She noticed that certain letters addressed to him never reached his hands. She noticed that Lady Corisande often appeared whenever financial matters were discussed. And she noticed that a particular account book from the Valancrest properties was always removed before she entered the library. At first, Evelyn assumed it was simply because she was not trusted. Then she found something that made her question everything. It happened late one evening when she passed the library and saw the door not fully closed. Inside, voices were speaking. Lady Corisande's voice. And another voice she did not recognize. "You must maintain the arrangement until the inheritance matter is settled," Corisande said. Evelyn stopped. The candle in her hand flickered. The girl cannot know what the contract truly contains. A pause followed. Then the stranger replied. And if she discovers the missing pages, Evelyn felt her fingers tighten around the candle holder. Missing pages. From her marriage contract. She stepped back before anyone could see her. Her first instinct was to demand answers, but something stopped her. For the first time since entering Greyhaven, Manor Evelyn understood that the marriage had never only been about saving Ashcombe Cottage. There was something hidden beneath the ink, something someone feared she would find. The next morning a message arrived ordering her to prepare for a journey away from Greyhaven, not as a duchess, not as a wife, but as a woman being quietly removed before she could ask the wrong questions. And when Evelyn opened the small locked box her father had left behind, she discovered a letter she had never seen before, a letter bearing the Valancrest seal. A letter that suggested her marriage contract had been created for a reason far more dangerous than either family had admitted. Evelyn did not open the letter immediately. She carried it upstairs beneath the cover of her shawl, moving through the long corridor where portraits of the Valancrest family watched silently from gilded frames. The manor seemed unchanged, yet every corner now appeared different. The locked study, the missing account book, the whispered conversation behind the half-closed door. They were no longer separate moments. They were pieces of something carefully arranged. Inside her chamber, Evelyn placed the letter beside her father's old wooden box and examined the seal again. It was not broken. It had been preserved exactly as it had been sent. Someone had hidden it. Someone had wanted it forgotten. Her first thought was of Lady Honoria, who had controlled every remaining possession from Ashcombe Cottage after her father's death. But the Valancrest seal changed the question entirely. Why would a letter from Julian's family be hidden among her father's belongings? The answer, whatever it was, connected two families that had spent years pretending they had nothing to do with one another. A soft knock interrupted her thoughts. Evelyn closed the box at once. "Come in." It was Mrs. Whitmore, one of the older housemaids who had served Greyhaven Manor longer than most of the current family had lived there. The woman entered carrying a tray of tea but did not immediately place it down. "Your Grace," she said quietly, "I thought you should know something." Evelyn looked at her. Mrs. Whitmore glanced toward the corridor before speaking. "Lady Coruscant has instructed the staff not to assist you with your departure." A strange calm settled over Evelyn. Departure. The maid lowered her eyes. "She told the household that you were returning to Ashcombe because the marriage arrangement had reached its natural conclusion, not because the Duchess had chosen to leave, not because there was a disagreement, but because the story had already been written for her." Evelyn understood then that the order was not simply about removing her from Greyhaven. It was about controlling what everyone believed had happened. "Mrs. Whitmore," Evelyn asked, "how long has Lady Coruscant been managing matters at this house?" The older woman hesitated. Long enough to believe no one would question her. The answer was not a confession, but it was enough. For the first time since arriving at Greyhaven Manor, Evelyn realized she was not the only person who had been forced into silence. Mrs. Whitmore had seen things. Others had seen things. And somewhere among the servants, the hidden truth of the Valancrest family had been waiting for someone brave enough to ask the right questions. Evelyn placed her hand over the locked box. She had entered this marriage believing she was saving her father's home. Now she suspected she had been brought into Greyhaven because someone needed her to sign away something far more valuable. And before she could leave the estate, she would have to discover what the missing pages of that contract had taken from her. Evelyn waited until the household had fallen into its usual evening silence before returning to the small room beside the library. It was not a room the family used often. It contained old ledgers, forgotten correspondence, and boxes of papers that had lost their importance in the eyes of those who now controlled Greyhaven Manor. But Evelyn had learned something during her short time there. The things people considered worthless were often the things they stopped protecting. A single candle burned beside her as she searched through the shelves. The rain tapped against the windows, and the cold air slipped through the old wooden frames. She was not searching for proof yet. She was searching for a reason why a marriage contract between two families would require missing pages. A reason why Lady Coruscant feared questions. A reason why Julian Valancrest, the man who had publicly dismissed her, had allowed the arrangement to continue without ever examining what had truly been placed before him. Near the bottom shelf, Evelyn found a narrow account ledger covered in dust. The leather binding was cracked. The pages inside were yellowed. But the name written on the first page made her stop. Ashcombe, her father's estate. Her fingers moved carefully across the ink. The ledger did not contain personal letters or declarations. It contained numbers, payments, transfers. Amounts that had moved between Ashcombe and Valancrest years before her marriage had ever been discussed. Evelyn read each entry twice. Then a third time. Her father had not been ruined by careless spending, as Lady Honoria had claimed. The debts had appeared after money connected to the Valancrest estate began disappearing. A sound behind her made her turn. The library door had opened slightly, only a narrow space, only enough for someone standing outside to listen. Evelyn did not move. She remembered the rule of Greyhaven Manor. Truth travelled through half-open doors, so she lowered the ledger and allowed her expression to change. "I suppose there is little point in searching further," she said aloud. Silence. Then footsteps. Someone moved away quickly down the corridor. Evelyn waited until the sound disappeared. Only then did she approach the door. No one was there. But on the floor lay a small piece of paper that had slipped beneath the doorway. Her heart tightened. She picked it up. 3 words had been written across it. Do not trust him. Not Lady Coruscant. Not the solicitor. Not the servants. Him. Julian Valancrest. Evelyn stared at the warning. She wanted to dismiss it. She wanted to believe her husband was simply a distant man trapped by family expectations. But the evidence before her was becoming impossible to ignore. Someone inside Greyhaven feared Julian, or someone wanted her to fear him, and Evelyn knew the difference mattered. The following morning, Julian returned from a meeting concerning the northern properties. He entered the breakfast room expecting the same quiet formality that had existed between them since their wedding. Instead, he found Evelyn waiting, not angry, not tearful, prepared. You wished me to leave Greyhaven before dawn, she said. Julian looked at her carefully. I believed it would be better for both of us. For whom was it better, Your Grace? The question unsettled him, not because of the accusation, because of the certainty behind it. Evelyn placed the folded paper beside his plate. His eyes moved to the message. For the first time, the Duke of Valancrest looked genuinely concerned. Where did you find this? That is not the question you should be asking. Julian looked back at her. The room seemed suddenly smaller. The servants nearby became silent. Evelyn continued. The question is why someone believes I should not trust my own husband. Julian did not answer immediately, and that silence told her more than any words could have done. Because it was not the silence of a man who knew nothing. It was the silence of a man who knew there were things he had never told her. Outside, the winter rain continued to fall against Greyhaven's stone walls. Inside, the contract that had created their marriage began to reveal the first cracks in the arrangement everyone believed they controlled. Julian did not reach for the paper. He did not deny knowing the handwriting. He did not dismiss the warning as the work of a jealous servant or a careless gossip. Instead, he folded the note once and placed it beneath his hand. That small movement told Evelyn more than an argument would have. You should not have been brought into this, he said at last. The answer was not what she expected. She had prepared herself for anger, for another reminder that she was only a wife by contract. But she had not prepared for regret into what Evelyn asked. Julian looked toward the tall windows overlooking the gardens where the winter branches stood bare beneath the grey sky. The matter that existed before you arrived at Greyhaven. That is not an answer. No, he admitted quietly, it is not. The honesty surprised her. For months, Julian had spoken like a man who believed every emotion was a weakness that must be hidden. Yet now, standing across from her, he appeared less like a powerful duke and more like someone who had discovered that the walls he trusted were built on uncertain ground. Evelyn placed her hand over the ledger she had carried with her. My father's estate lost money connected to yours. Julian's expression changed. Only for a moment. But it was enough. You found the records. I found enough to know that I was never told the entire truth. The room became still. The servants nearby quietly stepped away, understanding that whatever conversation was taking place was no longer a simple disagreement between husband and wife. Julian lowered his voice. I was told your father's debts came from poor management, and do you believe that? A pause. Not a long one, but a meaningful one. No. The word was barely above a whisper. Evelyn felt something shift. Not forgiveness, not trust, something smaller. The first recognition that perhaps they had both been trapped by the same deception. Julian moved toward the fireplace but did not turn away from her. When my father died, I inherited an estate already weakened by years of decisions made by others. Lady Coruscant insisted she was protecting the family. She said certain documents had to be handled carefully until the inheritance matters were settled. Until the inheritance matters were settled, Evelyn repeated. The phrase from the hidden conversation. Julian looked at her sharply. You heard them? Yes. For the first time, the Duke looked genuinely alarmed. Who else? No one who knows enough to be dangerous. The answer carried a quiet warning. Evelyn was no longer the woman who had arrived at Greyhaven, hoping a contract could save her. She was watching, learning, choosing her words. Julian noticed. You have changed. Evelyn almost smiled. No, Your Grace. I have simply stopped assuming that everyone around me is telling the truth. The statement struck harder than anger, because it was deserved. Before he could answer, a sudden commotion came from the corridor. A servant hurried toward the room carrying a sealed envelope. Your Grace, this was found among the papers prepared for Her Grace's departure. Julian took it immediately. The seal was broken. The contents had already been examined. Evelyn watched his face as he read. The color left his expression. What is it? She asked. He looked at her. For a moment she thought he might hide it, that he might choose silence again. But instead he handed her the paper. It was a copy of a statement prepared by a solicitor. A statement declaring that Evelyn Ashcombe had voluntarily abandoned Greyhaven Manor and surrendered any claim connected to the marriage arrangement. Her breath caught. It was not merely an order for her to leave. Someone had prepared the evidence to make it appear that she had chosen to disappear. And if that document reached society before she could defend herself, her reputation would be destroyed. They intended to remove you quietly, Julian said. Evelyn looked at him. No. Her voice was calm. They intended to make certain no one would believe me after I was gone. The truth settled between them. Not as an accusation, as a fact. Somewhere inside Greyhaven Manor, someone was no longer trying to end a marriage. They were trying to erase a woman. And for the first time since their contract had been signed, Julian Valancrest understood that protecting his estate might require protecting the wife he had never allowed himself to. No, Julian did not return to the breakfast room after that conversation. Instead, he went directly to his study and locked the door. It was the same room where Evelyn had once heard the whispers behind the half-open door, the same room where account books disappeared whenever she entered. But this time the key turned from the inside, not to keep her out, to keep everyone else away. Evelyn remained in the corridor for a moment, watching the closed door. She had spent months believing that the Duke of Valancrest was simply another person who had accepted the arrangement because it benefited him. Now she was forced to consider something far more complicated. Perhaps he had also been used. Perhaps he had also been given only the parts of the truth that served someone else's purpose. That evening, Mrs. Whitmore quietly approached her near the servants' staircase. "Your Grace," the older woman whispered, "there is something you should see." She led Evelyn to the old household records room, a narrow space near the kitchen where previous stewards had stored documents before they were moved to the main archives. From beneath a stack of unused inventory papers, Mrs. Whitmore removed a small envelope. "I found this years ago," she said. "I was told to burn it." Evelyn looked at her. "Why did you not?" The maid gave a faint, tired smile. "Because I have lived long enough to know that people who demand a paper be destroyed usually fear what it says." Inside was not a confession. Not yet. It was a single page, torn from a larger document. At the bottom was her father's signature, and beneath it was another name, Lady Corisande Valawick. Evelyn held the page carefully. The contract that had brought her to Greyhaven was not simply a marriage agreement. It was connected to the financial arrangement that had damaged Ashcombe years before, and someone had spent years ensuring neither family would see the complete truth. For the first time since arriving at Greyhaven, Manor Evelyn was no longer searching for a way to escape. She was searching for the reason she had been brought there. Evelyn kept the torn page hidden inside the lining of her gown, not because she feared discovery, because she had learned that at Greyhaven Manor, even a harmless piece of paper could become a weapon when placed in the wrong hands. The following days brought a strange change to the household. No announcement was made, no apology was offered. Yet the servants who had once avoided her now looked at her differently. They noticed that she no longer walked through the halls like a guest waiting for permission to exist. They noticed that she asked questions, she examined records, she remembered names, and she listened. The greatest danger at Greyhaven had never been the cold stone walls or the winter winds outside. It was the belief that no one would challenge what had always been accepted. Evelyn began with the smallest details. A payment recorded under one name, a missing receipt, a date that did not match, a signature copied too neatly. She spent hours in the library comparing old accounts while the fire burned low beside her. The work was unfamiliar, but she had learned from her father that numbers could reveal what people tried to hide. Money could be disguised, it could be moved, but it could not forget where it had been. One evening Julian entered the library and found her surrounded by papers. He stopped at the doorway. Months earlier he would have considered the sight inappropriate. A duchess investigating estate records, a wife refusing to accept the role assigned to her. Now he only looked concerned. "You should not be doing this alone." Evelyn did not look up. "I was doing it alone before you offered to help." The words were sharp, but they were true. Julian accepted them. "I know." That answer made her pause. He crossed the room slowly and placed a small key beside the documents. "My father kept a second archive." Evelyn looked at the key, where below the old study. Her expression changed. "The locked room," Julian nodded. "I was told it contained papers that were no longer relevant." "And did you believe that?" A shadow passed across his face. No, the admission carried more weight than she expected. because a duke admitting he had been deceived was not a small thing, especially not a man who had spent his entire life being taught that control was the same as strength. Together they entered the hidden archive beneath the study. The room smelled of dust and old leather. Shelves lined the walls filled with correspondence account books and sealed folders. Not forgotten, preserved. Waiting. Julian moved toward a cabinet at the back. Before he reached it, Evelyn noticed something. A space on the shelf where a document had recently been removed. Someone had already been there. Someone knew they were looking. Julian saw it too. Neither of them spoke, because they both understood the same thing. The enemy inside Greyhaven Manor was no longer trying to hide the truth. They were trying to stay ahead of it. And somewhere in that missing space was the piece of evidence that could reveal whether Evelyn's marriage had been created to protect a family legacy or to conceal the theft of one. The missing space on the shelf was not empty by accident. Evelyn ran her fingers along the edge of the wood and felt a small mark carved into the surface. Not a scratch, a symbol. A simple line crossed by two smaller strokes. Julian stepped closer. My father used that mark on private correspondence. Evelyn looked at him. Then this was not removed randomly. No. His voice was quieter than before. Someone knew exactly what they were taking. They searched the remaining documents more carefully, not with the desperation of people looking for proof, with the patience of people who had finally understood that every detail mattered. Inside a sealed folder they found copies of old estate agreements. Most were ordinary. Land transfers, property repairs, servant payments. But one document was different. It carried the Ashcombe name, and beneath the signature lines was a clause Evelyn had never seen. A clause connected to her marriage. She read it slowly. Her face remained composed, but Julian saw the change in her eyes. What does it say? Evelyn lifted the page. It says the marriage agreement was intended to protect Ashcombe property from being absorbed into another estate. Julian frowned. That is impossible. The contract I signed stated the opposite. Exactly. The silence that followed was heavy, not because they had discovered the answer, because they had discovered two different answers. Someone had altered the version both of them received. Someone had taken a document meant to protect her inheritance and transformed it into a tool that could remove her rights. Julian turned away, running a hand across his face. I thought I was preserving my family's future. Evelyn watched him, and I thought I was saving my father's home. Neither of them spoke for several moments. They had entered the archive searching for a criminal. Instead, they had found the shape of a deception that had trapped them both. It was not forgiveness. Not yet. But for the first time, Evelyn saw something she had not expected to find in her husband. Regret. The next morning, Lady Coruscant arrived in the library without warning. She carried herself with the confidence of someone who believed every room still belonged to her. I understand you have been spending rather more time among the estate papers, she said. Evelyn closed the ledger in front of her. And I understand you have been spending rather more time deciding what I should know. Coruscant's expression hardened. You should be careful, Duchess. Curiosity can damage a woman's reputation, only when the truth threatens someone. For a moment the older woman said nothing, then she stepped closer. You were brought into this family because you were useful. Do not confuse a title with influence. The words were meant to wound. But Evelyn no longer heard them as an insult. She heard them as a confession, because Coruscant had not said Evelyn was powerless. She had said Evelyn had been chosen for a purpose, and now Evelyn needed to discover what that purpose had truly been. That evening, while reviewing the copied pages from the archive, Evelyn found one final detail, a name written beside the altered contract. A solicitor who had handled the agreement years before. A man who had supposedly retired and disappeared from London society. But beneath his name was an address. An address in a small village beyond the Valancrest lands. And for the first time since leaving, Ashcombe Evelyn saw a path forward. The truth was no longer buried inside Greyhaven Manor. It was waiting somewhere beyond its walls. The journey beyond Greyhaven could not begin openly. Evelyn understood that immediately. A woman of her position did not simply leave a ducal estate without questions following behind her. Every carriage departure was observed. Every servant's conversation carried. Every movement could be turned into a story before she had the chance to speak for herself. So she and Julian made their preparations quietly. Not as husband and wife pretending affection, not as strangers bound by an agreement, but as two people who had discovered they were standing on the same side of a secret neither had created. Mrs. Whitmore helped them gather what they needed. She provided an old travel cloak for Evelyn, and quietly arranged for a carriage that would not attract attention from the main entrance. Before leaving, Evelyn returned once more to her chamber, the room where she had first arrived as a duchess, the room where she had unpacked gowns, chosen for a life she believed would be secure. She looked around and realized something had changed. She was not leaving because she had been dismissed. She was leaving because she had chosen a direction for herself. For the first time in her life, Evelyn Ashcombe stepped forward without waiting for someone else to decide where she belonged. Outside the manor, the winter air was sharp and unforgiving. The road toward the village was muddy from rain, and the fields surrounding Greyhaven disappeared slowly behind them. Julian sat across from her in silence for some time. Then he spoke. "When this is over, you may still decide to leave me." Evelyn looked at him. The honesty surprised her. Months earlier, she would have expected a duke to demand loyalty because of a title. Instead, he was acknowledging that she had a choice. "That depends on what the truth reveals," she replied. Julian nodded. He did not ask for reassurance. He did not ask for forgiveness, and that more than anything made her believe his regret was genuine. When they reached the village, they found the solicitor's former residence abandoned. The windows were covered. The garden had been left unattended. But the place had not been empty for long. Inside the small house, they discovered signs that someone had searched through it recently. Drawers were open. Papers were scattered. A desk had been forced apart. Someone had arrived before them. Evelyn walked slowly toward the damaged desk. On the floor beneath it was a single envelope that had escaped the search. Her name was written across the front. Not Duchess of Valancrest, not Lady Evelyn. Only Evelyn Ashcombe. Her hands tightened around the envelope, because whoever had written it had known exactly who she was before the world gave her a title. And as she broke the seal, she realized the answer they had traveled to find was not hidden in the solicitor's missing records. It had been waiting for her personally. Evelyn unfolded the letter with care. The paper was old, but the handwriting remained clear. It was her father's hand. For a moment, the small room disappeared around her. The abandoned house, the broken desk, the signs of someone searching before them, all of it faded beneath the weight of seeing a familiar name written by someone who could no longer explain himself. "My dearest Evelyn." The letter began without a title, without the formal language expected between members of respectable families. Only a father speaking to his daughter. Evelyn read slowly. Her father had known that his estate was being placed under pressure. He had known that certain accounts did not match. He had known that people around him wanted him to accept losses quietly rather than question powerful names. But the most painful discovery was not that he had been deceived. It was that he had suspected exactly who was responsible. Lady Corisande. The letter explored retentus. Attention had approached him years before Evelyn's marriage, offering a solution to his financial difficulties. A marriage agreement between Ashcombe and Valancrest. A union that would appear to strengthen both families. But her father had discovered a hidden condition. If certain circumstances occurred, Ashcombe lands would eventually pass into Valancrest control. The agreement had never been designed to protect both families. It had been designed to protect one family from losing power. Evelyn stopped reading. The cold from outside seemed to enter the room. She had spent months believing her marriage had been a sacrifice made to save her home. Now she understood the crueler truth. Her marriage had been arranged because someone wanted control of that home. Julian took the letter only after she handed it to him. His eyes moved across the page. With every line, his expression grew darker. "My aunt knew." It was not a question. Evelyn looked at him. "Yes." Julian lowered the letter. "I defended her." The words carried more shame than anger. He had not signed the altered contract with the intention of harming Evelyn, but he had accepted a version of events because believing his family was honorable had been easier than admitting they might not be. Evelyn understood that feeling. She had also trusted people because the alternative was too painful. The difference was that her trust had cost her a home. His had placed him in a position to take one. Before either of them could speak again, a sound came from outside. A carriage. Not approaching the house. Leaving. Julian moved toward the window. Through the rain-covered glass they saw a figure climbing into a dark carriage at the end of the lane. The person turned briefly. Evelyn could not see the face, but Julian recognized the crest on the carriage door. His expression changed. Greyhaven. The person who had searched the solicitor's house had not been a stranger. They had come from the estate itself. And they had not come to find the truth. They had come to remove it. Evelyn folded her father's letter and placed it safely inside her coat. For the first time since entering Greyhaven Manor, she no longer felt like a woman waiting to be judged. She had evidence. She had a witness. And she had finally discovered the one thing her enemies had underestimated. They had believed a woman without power could be controlled. They had forgotten that a woman who had already lost everything had very little left to fear. The road back to Greyhaven was no longer the road Evelyn had travelled months before. When she had first arrived, she had looked at the stone towers of the manor and wondered whether she would ever feel that she belonged within them. Now she looked at those same towers and saw something else. A place where secrets had been protected for too long. A place where powerful people had mistaken silence for loyalty. Julian arranged for them to enter through the side entrance rather than the main doors. They could not allow Lady Corisande to know what they had found before they were ready, but someone inside Greyhaven already knew they had returned. The moment they stepped into the entrance hall, they found the solicitor's copy of the altered agreement placed upon the table. Beside it was a message, a warning. Leave this matter buried or lose what remains. Evelyn read the words without fear. Months earlier, such a threat might have shaken her. Now it only confirmed what she already knew. The person behind the deception was becoming desperate. Julian looked toward the staircase. She knows we found something. Evelyn folded the message. No. She knows we found enough to frighten her. The distinction mattered. Because fear made people careless, and careless people revealed the truth. That evening Julian called for the estate records to be brought from the locked archive. For the first time he did not act as a duke protecting his family name. He acted as a man prepared to examine the damage done in that name. Mrs. Whitmore joined them quietly. The old servant placed a small bundle of letters on the table. I kept these because I thought one day someone would need them. Evelyn looked at the bundle. You knew. I knew something was wrong, Mrs. Whitmore replied. I did not know the whole of it. But I knew whenever a person demands that every question disappear, there is usually an answer they fear. Among the letters was one written by the former steward of Greyhaven. It confirmed that Lady Corisande had ordered certain accounts moved between properties, not enough to immediately expose her, but enough to show a pattern. A pattern that connected Ashcombe's losses, the altered marriage contract, and the attempt to remove Evelyn from Greyhaven. The final piece was still missing. The original contract. Without it, Corisande could claim that every document they possessed was incomplete. The next day, Evelyn returned to the ballroom where she had been humiliated. The same room, the same polished floor, the same walls that had witnessed her being treated as a woman without value. But this time she entered beside Julian, not behind him, not beneath him. Beside him. The guests who had once whispered about her departure now watched in silence. Lady Corisande stood near the fireplace, composed as ever. You have returned, she said. Evelyn met her gaze. Yes, and have you found what you were searching for? Evelyn allowed a brief pause. Not everything. Corisande smiled faintly. Then perhaps you should have searched more carefully. Evelyn looked around the room, at the same people who had laughed before, at the same people who had accepted the easiest version of the story. Then she answered calmly, Perhaps, but I have discovered something more important. The room became quiet. I have discovered that a person can hide a document, silence a servant, and control a household. Her eyes moved to Corisande. But they cannot control the truth forever. For the first time, Lady Corisande's confidence weakened, only slightly, but Evelyn saw it. And she understood that the battle was no longer about whether she could prove she had been wronged. It was about forcing the people who had benefited from that wrong to answer for it publicly. Because the contract that had been used to control her was not lost. It was somewhere, and whoever had hidden it had made one mistake. They had left behind enough clues for Evelyn Ashcombe to find it. The search for the original contract began with the smallest forgotten details. Not in the grand rooms where the Valancrest family displayed its wealth, not among the documents that had been arranged carefully for important visitors, but among the places where ordinary hands had preserved what powerful people had overlooked. Evelyn returned to the servants' quarters with Mrs. Whitmore. The older woman led her to a narrow cupboard beneath the old staircase, where household records from previous generations had been stored before being considered unnecessary. "I always wondered why Lady Corisande insisted these papers be moved away," Mrs. Whitmore said. Inside were old inventories, household notes, and correspondence between former stewards. Evelyn searched through them slowly. Then she found a small register hidden between two account books. It was not a contract. It was a record of items transferred from the old study after Julian's father's death. Among the listed objects was a locked dispatch box, removed from the archive, placed in the care of Lady Corisande. The entry was dated only days before the altered marriage contract had been prepared. Evelyn held the register tightly. She never destroyed it. Julian, standing beside her, looked at the page. She kept it, not because she wanted to protect the truth, because she believed she would always control who could reach it. For the first time, Evelyn understood the weakness behind Corisande's actions. The woman had not hidden the contract because she had no fear. She had hidden it because she had always feared the moment someone brave enough would search. That evening, Julian confronted his aunt in the drawing room. Lady Corisande remained calm when he entered. "You have been asking questions you should have asked years ago," she said. Julian stood before her. "And you have been answering questions that no one asked." The older woman's expression hardened. "You would risk your family name for a woman who arrived here with nothing?" Julian did not react. "That woman arrived here with more honesty than this family has shown her." The words surprised even Evelyn, who listened from the corridor. She had not intended to hear their conversation, but the door had been left slightly open. And in Greyhaven Manor, truth had always travelled through openings people forgot to close. Corisande lowered her voice. "You think you are protecting her. You are only destroying yourself." "No," Julian replied. His voice was steady. "I am finally refusing to protect a lie." The silence that followed was different from the silences Evelyn had known before. Not the silence of humiliation, not the silence of fear, the silence before something ended. The next morning the dispatch box was found, not in Corisande's private rooms, not in the family archive, but inside a storage chamber near the old library, hidden behind a false wooden panel. Inside was the original marriage contract. And beside it was a letter from Julian's father, a letter that revealed the agreement had never been intended to transfer Ashcombe property to Valancrest. It had been written to protect Evelyn's inheritance until she reached a position where she could manage it herself. The altered pages had not created a marriage. They had stolen its meaning. Evelyn read the letter twice. For years she had believed her father had failed to protect her. Now she understood that he had tried. Someone else had simply worked harder to bury his final attempt. And as the household prepared for the gathering where the truth would finally be revealed before the same society that had once watched her humiliation, Evelyn knew the moment had come. The contract that had been used to silence her would now become the evidence that restored her voice.